Welcome to the latest lecture for AP Government. Um, we're starting in, well, not starting in. So obviously we began the concept of civil rights and civil liberties at the end of last week, and we've already gone through sort of the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment. So some of this is going to be a little redundant. Please bear with me, but it is important, so it bears repeating. So the Bill of Rights obviously is a statement, a list of those protections that we have from the national government. And originally, as originally written, it only applied to the national government. And over the course of time and through the 14th Amendment, we've had something called selective incorporation that has changed the application of the Bill of Rights to also apply to state and local government. The Bill of Rights were originally added by popular demand. They were a compromise. They were a necessity to many Americans because they wanted to ensure that as we created a stronger national government after the failings of the Articles of Confederation, that we didn't create a national government so strong that it could take power from the people. It is important to note that your civil liberties are not absolute. You do not have absolute freedoms. In fact, this goes back to the social contract theory that we talked about a while ago. And in the social contract theory, I think I mentioned that you give up sort of trivial freedom. And so when I say trivial freedom, what I mean is that concept of the freedom to drive wherever you want, right? Left side of the road, right side of the road, right down the middle, whatever. It's trivial freedom. But even your civil liberties, which are not trivial by any stretch of the imagination, are limited. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, for instance. And so we'll talk about some of those limitations as we talk about the individual freedoms. The next couple of slides are literally just a rundown of the actual Bill of Rights. And so you're welcome to pause these. I'll stop on each one for a moment in case you want to pause them, but obviously we went over these last Thursday already. So the First Amendment is arguably the most important. Again, we talked about this, and then we did talk about the 14th Amendment as well on Thursday. And the 14th Amendment is what is going to be utilized for incorporation, because ultimately the 14th Amendment is what protects basically everybody. It establishes the due process clause and the equal protection clause. So the due process clause is the idea that you cannot have your rights taken from you without due process, which is legal proceedings that have to occur. And the equal protection clause is the idea that everybody is equal under the law. Now we will find that not all of the Bill of Rights have been incorporated, but theoretically they all could be. I mean, there's one, the Third Amendment. The Third Amendment will never, ever be incorporated, because the Third Amendment, if you remember, is quartering of soldiers, right? So you don't have to keep troops in your house. That'll never be. I mean, it'll never apply to states because states don't have their own army, so it's not applicable. Therefore, it'll never be incorporated. This is just the idea of selective incorporation. We'll talk about this more in more detail when we move on in this unit. But the idea of selective incorporation, selective means on a case-by-case basis, and incorporation means we're going to incorporate that right. Incorporate. So we're going to take the right that you have, the protection you have from the national government, we're going to apply it to the state government as well, or to local government as well. And so these are just a variety of cases over the course of time that have applied different provisions within the Bill of Rights to the states. Again, the third, obviously not incorporated. Fifth has not been incorporated, although states do it anyways. Most of these are not cases that you would need to know anyway. But it is important for you to understand these sort of general concepts. Again, right to a jury trial in a civil case. Again, states offer you that anyways. And no state has ever imposed an excessive bail or fine, so it's never been challenged and brought to the Supreme Court. And so if it's never brought to the Supreme Court, there's never a state behavior that's challenged under this concept, then selective incorporation doesn't exist. So we'll start in then, and we sort of broadly went over some of these concepts, but we'll go into more detail now. So one of the first provisions of the First Amendment is the idea of freedom of religion, and freedom of religion is twofold, right? So we have the Establishment Clause and we have the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause says that government will establish no official religion. There will be no national religion. What that means is the government will not educate you or indoctrinate you toward a specific religion. The government will not advocate for specific religious activities in school. There are a number of cases and provisions in which school prayer has been deemed to be unconstitutional and in violation of the Establishment Clause. The teaching of sort of creation theory versus evolution has been a part of this as well. And then public displays are a part of the Establishment Clause. Now, when I say public displays, I mean things like the Ten Commandments on the courthouse steps, and I believe it was Kentucky. It was a southern state. I forget the state off the top of my head. But can the courthouse have the Ten Commandments there? And understand that there are different provisions for different entities. And so when we look at when we look at education, right? Lemon v. Kurtzman is basically the first, and Lemon v. Kurtzman is no longer. I don't think it's one of your required cases. I don't know. I don't have the list in front of me. If it's not one of your required cases, it's actually a shame. Lemon v. Kurtzman is an incredibly important case. It does establish the Lemon test. And essentially what the Lemon v. Kurtzman does is it's a three-pronged approach, right? And so the basic concept behind the three-pronged approach is are we promoting or advocating for a specific religion? Then are we doing that at the expense of other religions? And then third, is there excessive entanglement between religion and government in this instance? And so this is in regard to aid to parochial schools. So basically the idea is if we're going to give money to and a parochial school means a religious school, right? But if we're going to give money to it, does it have a non-religious purpose, right? Are we spending the money for a non-religious purpose, right? So you have to have a secular purpose. Then you can't advance or inhibit the individual religion, and then you can't have excessive entanglement. So when you look at aid to like parochial schools, if we're spending money for math textbooks, right? That's a secular purpose. In which case, theoretically, that would be permissible, even though it's a private school. And so it becomes a very, very complex issue, because here's the other thing you have to understand about all of this, right? If we as the government give a parochial school, let's just say for the sake of argument, $10,000 to buy math textbooks, right? And so they use that $10,000 and they buy math textbooks, but they also buy a whole bunch of Bibles and they teach Bible class, right? If we're giving them $10,000, are we not also funding Bible class? if they paid for the Bibles on their own because it came out of a different fund, it becomes sort of a complex issue, because theoretically, if you don't give them the $10,000, they have to buy the math textbooks anyways. They have to, because they have to have math textbooks, because otherwise they wouldn't meet the accreditation requirements of a school within a state. So when we give them money for the math textbooks, it simply ups their total budget in order for them to use what would have been secular monies, right? Meaning monies for non-religious institution, non-religious indoctrination, or whatever word you want to use, right? For non-religious studies. Now all of a sudden, because their total budget is increased, then theoretically that also increases their ability to proselytize or teach Bible courses or whatever. So it's a wildly complex issue, and the Lemon test is not. I mean, it's honestly it's so complex that it's almost not a good test. And the third concept on there is their excessive entanglement. I mean, excessive is a very subjective word. So what's excessive to one individual is not excessive to another individual. But ultimately, this is a key concept in terms of education and religion, or in terms of religious freedoms. So the second part here, or a continuation of this, of the Establishment Clause, you may or may not be aware, I don't know, but the churches routinely, especially as they're first starting out or as they're beginning, they need meeting places, and a lot of the times, if you're a very small church, you might be meeting in an individual's home. As the church begins to grow, before they have a building, one of the things that they can do is they can rent out school buildings, right? And schools are actually routinely rented out for a wide variety of purposes, right? Whether it's like gridiron football on the George Ranch football field, or the gym or the auditorium. I don't know. George Ranch has a church that meets there Sunday mornings. I don't know where they meet, nor do I know the name of the church. But I think Pauley Ryan has one. I know Terry High School has one. So it's a fairly common thing. So long as schools and school districts open it up to all religions, that's perfectly acceptable. The thing that becomes most controversial, though, in terms of the Establishment Clause, is the idea of school prayer. So if you think about it, because all of you have been at George Ranch for a while now, you may remember back when Dr. Black was here, the morning announcements at one point, it would be students may reflect, pray, or meditate, or engage in any other silent activity so as not likely to disrupt or interrupt other students or whatever it was. Reflect, pray, or meditate. And that's really a way around sort of this concept of prayer in school. So one, Dr. Black certainly wasn't leading prayer, in which case that would be deemed permissible. But two, he was affording you an opportunity to do a wide variety of behaviors, simply one of which was praying. So when you look at prayer in schools, it's complex, because there's some issues at hand. For instance, if I were to take my my baseball team, for instance, and we were to before or after a game, all go out and circle around the pitcher's mound and kneel, and we said the Lord's Prayer, and I led that. That's actually sort of dicey as to whether or not that's permissible, as to whether or not that's allowable. I mean, I can encourage my players to do it. Theoretically, I could join in with them. But the reality is if it's school sponsored, then it's not really permissible. And so when I say school sponsored, I mean if I'm the one to do it, right? So for instance, if I'm the one to sort of lead my players in prayer because I am a school employee, because I am a state employee, because I'm a government employee, It's no longer permissible. And part of the reason for that is if you're not religious, I mean, if you're on my baseball team and you're not religious, or maybe even worse, maybe you're religious but you're not my religion, then you might feel compelled to pray with me. Because then you might be like, well, if I don't, I'm going to make Coach Baker mad, and then he's not going to play me, I'm not going to get playing time, I'm not going to get bats. Like, it becomes a very complex ordeal. Now, that being said, I mean, I've been a part of all sorts of athletic programs over my years as a coach, some of which just are openly religious, for lack of a better term. And so understand that even though that's unacceptable, sort of constitutionally, there are a number of places that disregard that, and so long as there's no, I mean, we'll get into this concept in a minute, but the reality is, so long as it's not in violation of like community standard, it's acceptable. There's actually a school district here in the Houston area, Santa Fe High School, that got into some very, very controversial aspects of school prayer and what their cheerleaders could and could not write on signs before football games that the players ran through, because it was school sponsored, because the school paid for the paper and the paint, but the cheerleaders did it themselves, and so it's not school sponsored, and so it's a wildly complex issue. Evolution, so the idea of teaching creationism versus evolutionism, the courts basically say you can't require creationism as a method of instruction, and you cannot deny evolution as a method of instruction. Theoretically, you can allow for both. If you present creationism as sort of a theory, it's generally deemed to be more permissible. And for the simple fact is that obviously, like, there's holes in science, right? I mean, science is fact. We know X, Y, and Z because of the scientific method and data and research and experimentation, right? But when you look at something like creationism, for instance, or actually, let's start with evolution, right? You look at evolution, the theory of evolution, is it true, right? And the answer is absolutely yes if you look at microevolution, right? So microevolution is, the fact that, some people used to be born with 6 fingers, right? And that's no need for it. And so that's sort of filtered its way out of the human genome. You look at microevolution of things like melanin production in the human body, right? And various regions produced more or less melatonin based upon, sun exposure and things of that nature. So microevolution is absolutely true, right? Macroevolution, there's a couple of gaps, some holes that we just haven't filled in yet. So theoretically, it could still be true. We know microevolution is true. But also, if you think about, macroevolution, I mean, if macroevolution takes centuries, there's going to be some significant gaps just due to the amount of time there. That being said, though, we also know that evolution has a huge hole in it. And that huge hole is the fact that scientifically, we know every cell comes from a pre-existing cell. Like, that's how reproduction of cells occurs, right? Is mitosis? I'm not a scientist. I think it's mitosis is the term, right? But it's the dividing of a cell. Well, if all cells have to come from a pre-existing cell, even if evolution were to be true, right? Like, one cell evolves into, over the course of millennia, human beings and the like and everything else. Where did the first cell come from? Right? And so you can deal with it in that way, but it's in education, it's also very easy to deal with a lot of things if you present them as theory rather than sort of fact. Public displays, when you look at it, are there legitimate sort of historical purposes, or is it promoting or advancing a singular religion? For instance, one of the questions that I ask students every year is could I have the 10 Commandments on the wall in my classroom, or would that be a violation of the Establishment Clause? And the answer would be, as a history teacher, as a social studies teacher, I actually probably could. I could probably get away with it, and I could probably justify it, because Judeo-Christian law is one of the three early examples of written law, which obviously then has a significant impact upon the historical evolution of law, and we're studying law, and I can get away with it. Can your science teacher have the 10 Commandments on the wall of their classroom? Probably not. It'd be far more problematic and far more difficult to justify. Another interesting one is the concept of sort of holiday decorations, right? Like, I'm sure you noticed that there's all sorts of like Christmas decorations that go up, and sometimes even on like public property, right? Whether it be schools or county courthouses or things like that. For the most part, so long as holiday decorations are not very, very specific to a religion, and so long as holiday decorations are inclusive of other ideas, they're generally deemed to be acceptable. And the reality is when you look at something like Christmas, if you put a Christmas tree up in a county courthouse or a city hall building in December, for the life of me, I don't know what a tree has to do with Jesus. So, and I think the courts would agree with me on that one. Now the Jesus, the Christ in the manger scenes that you see sometimes, that gets a little bit more dicey. Free exercise clause. This is the concept of you practicing your own religion. For the most part, when it comes to free exercise clause issues before the court is generally going to side with free exercise. They generally like allowing people to practice their religion as they so desire. Obviously, not all religions are protected. You can't just decide tomorrow you're gonna start the Church of Baker and be like, my religion is every Friday night I'm gonna get hammered and then I'm gonna drive home drunk. Like, no. You can't even be like, my religion is just to get hammered and go wander around a park, because it's still drunk in public. Okay? So not all religions are protected because the threshold of starting a religion is not that high. So if you ever want to start a cult, you could probably do it. Number two, your free exercise of religion cannot violate somebody else's rights or liberties. So, if you decided that you wanted to be whatever the Aztec religion was and engage in human sacrifice, that's not going to work, right? Not going to cut it. The Amish, Yoder versus Wisconsin, which is one of your required Supreme Court cases, is a really good example. So the Amish, obviously, if you know the Amish, you know anything about the Amish, they live as if it's 1820, right? Like they don't use cars, technology, phones, internet, yada, yada, yada. As a result, they actually don't send their children to school past 8th grade, which was a violation of state law, but as a part of their religion, they felt that it was unnecessary, and ultimately the court says, yeah, if you're Amish, you don't have to go to school after 8th grade. So if you're looking to drop out, all you gotta do is convert to Amishism, being Amish. So if you want to drop out of high school legally, just give up that smartphone and you're good. Strict scrutiny is a concept that will come up over and over again, and so you need to understand it. But basically, it just simply means like the highest level of when you scrutinize something, it's like really trying to nail it down to determine just how important or significant or necessary it is. And so the strict scrutiny concept as it pertains to the courts is basically the courts saying, if the state is going to do this, right, the burden of proof falls upon the state now that they need to show beyond like a reasonable doubt why this behavior is not permissible, or why this sort of discriminatory action is necessary, or whatever. And so strict scrutiny is that idea of limiting limiting the limitations, stopping the limitations on free exercise. Maybe that's the best way of saying it. Right, so this is just tolerance for the free speech rights of religious extremists. For the most part, we allow for free speech in the United States. It really is an essential freedom, and I would submit to you that protecting the free speech of extremists is actually the most important thing, because obviously your and my free speech is not necessarily under attack, but it is it routinely is a slippery slope. Once you begin to limit freedom of speech in any means, it becomes significantly easier to continue limiting freedom of speech as you move on. Muhammad Ali was actually, so before he was Muhammad Ali, he was a man named Cassius Clay, and there's a pretty good documentary about it, or not documentary, movie. But ultimately, he refused to go. He was drafted. He refused to go to Vietnam and claimed to be a conscientious objector. And his case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, and basically was given the freedom to not fight because it conflicted with his interpretation of Islam. That Islam is supposed to be a peaceful religion. And so he refused to fight, and ultimately the courts agreed with him, because there are other religions that have also been given exemptions in that regard. Freedom of expression, which is a general sort of concept that includes all sorts of freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of sort of expression goes into how you dress, how you non-verbally communicate, things like that. So prior restraint is one of the things we'll talk about: free speech, public order, and then obscenity and libel and slander. Then we'll talk about, symbolic speech, and then we get into free press, commercial speech, like all of these. We'll cover all of these because this is a very detailed, nuanced concept as well. So prior restraint, this is the idea that the government is going to prevent the publication of materials prior to the publication of those materials. And for the most part, that's not permissible. There's really one exception. That one exception is in national security, right? So, for instance, if you were a journalist, this actually happened back when I was in the Marine Corps. There was a journalist, Gerardo Rivera, I believe was his name, who was embedded with a Marine Corps unit, and so they were like live on CNN or MSNBC. I don't know what channel he was on, but like live on television, beamed back on satellites to the United States, and here he is in Iraq with these Marines, and there was prior restraint. There was some limitations on what he was allowed to report, and ultimately what he did is he basically had his cameraman point the camera down into the sand, and the dude drew a map and was like, "We're here." What, you think the enemy doesn't have satellite cable? Like, come on. And the military kicked him out. Like they removed him from the Middle East and took away his opportunity to be a live reporter embedded with the Marines because of what he violated in terms of national security. It is important for you to know that this does not apply to you. So if you write for the Wrangler or broadcast journalism or yearbook, you don't have any freedoms there. The government can absolutely, the government meaning HP, Ms. Patterson, or Mr. Toronto, or Miss Croker, I think, is still in charge of the Wrangler. Like, they can just axe your story. You're like, they can prevent you from doing it. You don't have any recourse there. Free speech and public order. So we do create a standard 100 years ago that basically says if there's a clear and present danger, that speech is not permissible. And that's not really the standard anymore. Imminent lawless action is really now the standard. Basically, imminent lawless action is really the concept of the idea that that if you are advocating for lawless action and it's believable that somebody would do it, right? So, for instance, if I told you, that you needed to go and overthrow the government, right, or that you needed to go and storm Sugar Land City Hall and try to take it over, right? Like if I told you to do that, that speech would not be protected. And the reason being is that there's probably some expectation that some of you might actually follow through with it because you're all super competitive and you want to have an A in my class and you're like, oh, Coach Baker said I got to do this, so I'm going to go do it, because if I don't do it, then I'm not going to get an A in this class, and if I don't get an A in this class, then I'm not going to get into like A&M or UT or wherever it is that I want to go, and then my life is just ruined, right? So, yeah, by the way, this is completely hypothetical. Do not, what did I say? Go storm the Sugar Land? Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. Please. I don't need that to fall back on me. But that's sort of the idea, right? Now, if there's literally like a homeless dude on the side of the road that's like overthrow the government, like on a cardboard sign, yeah, that's not. Ironically, his speech is probably protected there because nobody's going to follow a unwashed homeless dude in that instance. McCarthy, this is if you don't know anything about Joseph McCarthy, but basically he accused people of being communists like in the 1950s and tried to put all kinds of limitations on them, which theoretically would not be permissible today. That's what College Board tells me I should tell you, and that's what the textbook tells me I should tell you. I'm not 100% convinced of that, though. I kind of think that there are a lot of Americans today that would be totally down with McCarthyisms if it benefited their cause. I do believe that freedom of speech is in danger. And I think freedom of speech is in danger because we don't know how to disagree with one another civilly. And so it actually wouldn't surprise me. It really wouldn't if there were new sort of McCarthy-esque trials. And I could see them go either way, honestly. Like I could see, sort of the return to like, hey, you're socialist and you're trying to overthrow the government and that's not okay. Or I could see it as, you're a white supremacist because you don't believe in the Green New Deal. Which I'm not sure how one relates to the other, but apparently that's some people's way of thinking. Obscenity. Obscenity is not constitutionally protected. However, there's some limitations to it because one, what classifies as obscene? Because that's a very broad concept. What is obscene to you is not necessarily obscene to me. Yeah, I'm looking at you because like I don't think anything's obscene to you, but you know who you are. So the very idea, and so then it goes into like community standards, like what are the community standards as to what is or is not obscene. And ultimately, once we get to Miller v. California, where, and I forget the justice's name, but basically the justice was like, essentially it's about pornography, right? The justice is like, well, I don't know what it is. Like I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, right? Like how do you define obscene? Well, I don't know how to define it, but I'll know it when I see it. And so ultimately, the sort of standard anymore these days is there artistic value? Is there literary value? Is there political value to it? Is there some sort of value to this obscene material? And if so, it's generally deemed permissible, right? So, for instance, if you go to college and you ever have to read a book called Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, right? It's obscene. It is utterly obscene. It's disturbing. Yet it's still in print. You can go into any Barnes and Noble, or you can go to Amazon, or you can go to your public library probably and check out Lolita. So there's literary value to that work apparently, which makes it permissible. Violent video games. So when it comes to obscenity as like sort of sexual in nature, the government is more regulatory. When it comes to obscene in the sense of like violence or gore, the government is significantly less regulatory. It's one of the reasons why you see tons of like violent video games. Not that I think that they're, well, you can have whatever opinion you want on violent video games. Video games are childish anyways, just so you know. Libel and slander. So these are legal terms. Libel means that it's written. Slander means that it's spoken. But it's defamation of character. And they exist because they need to exist. You can't just run around and say whatever you want about whoever you want. But the threshold for a conviction for libel or slander is incredibly high, like incredibly high. So, for instance, if you if you were to write something about, Donald Trump, that he was a fornicator and a harlatan, and, you use, immoral, and use all sorts of like, strongly worded negative ideals about him, could he sue you for libel if you had written all that out? And theoretically, he could, but he's not going to win. Right? I mean, if I tweeted out tomorrow that Donald Trump is a pompous, narcissistic, misogynistic, what's the word? Cheater. I can't think of the word. Adulterer. That's the word. Could Donald Trump sue me for that? He could try. He wouldn't win because I'm not important. Nobody's going to listen to my opinion, right? Like nobody's opinion of Donald Trump is going to change based on what I said. And if Donald Trump, and that's the problem, because Donald Trump actually, if he's bringing suit against me, he has to prove that I've done damage to him, which he's not going to be able to prove because again, I'm a nobody, which makes libel and slander incredibly hard to actually prosecute. So, I mean, the reality is, when somebody says something mean about you, you just kind of need to go on about your way, like even if it's blatantly false, right? I mean, let's put it this way, like let's just say for the sake of argument that parents objected to the way that I teach this course because they thought that I was trying to indoctrinate you to be liberal or conservative or whatever it is that they thought, right? And so then they started some sort of like online campaign about how I'm, a terrible teacher and this, that, and the other. Ultimately, if nothing comes from it, you didn't really damage my reputation. Like that's whatever, right? Like I wouldn't have much legal recourse. Now, on the other hand, if you if you went on the Greatwood Facebook page and started talking about how I was, dealing with students inappropriately and it's in like a sexual nature, and then ultimately that I get fired and it costs me my job, and it's proven that it's not true right now because I lost my job and I probably lost my marriage. Right now, I can actually prove injury relatively easily, and I would be able to win at that point, right? But if you're just running around being like, Coach Baker's a terrible teacher, well, that's just your opinion. That's not really like slander. Like, yeah, it's mean. It hurts. It really does. But I'm not everybody's cup of tea. I get it. Public figures, it's even harder, right? Like so as difficult as it would be for me to prove sort of injury, if a parent were to get on the Greatwood Facebook page and be like, Baker's a terrible teacher, all right, whatever. Public figures, people like Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or Justin Bieber. I don't know why I'm thinking of him, but maybe because there's a lot of negative things that come out about him. But he can't really get that. Now, if things are intentionally false, like deliberately false, or if there's gross negligence, then those are instances where for a private individual, for again somebody like me, it becomes easier to meet this threshold. Symbolic speech is generally something that we protect under the First Amendment. Symbolic speech is essentially speech that's non-communicative, meaning that it's not spoken or written or signed or whatever. The reality is, if you ever go and take like a speech class, one of the things that you'll learn is, and I don't remember the statistics now, it's been years since I took a freshman speech class in college, but I think it's like 20% of what you say, 20% of communication are the actual words that come out of your mouth, right? Like 20% of communication is your word choice, your actual like verbal, audio, like receptors. Okay. The other 80%, some of them are still sort of auditory, right? Like tone and volume. Like if you ever meet anybody that doesn't ever talk any louder than this, it generally means that they lack confidence, right? And so that's you don't know that you're doing it, but you're inherently doing that as you listen to them. And you listen to somebody that speaks meekly, you automatically give less weight to what they're saying, because you're like, well, maybe they don't know what they're talking about, which is why they're so quiet about it. So symbolic speech then is really things that are non-communicative speech. So for instance, if I were to, when I was living in North Carolina, for instance, teachers on Wednesdays wore red in solidarity for like terrible working conditions. The school that I worked at in North Carolina, like the air conditioner didn't work very often. Our textbooks were 10 to 15 years out of date. We were making, just peanuts. And so teachers all wore red on Wednesdays. That's symbolic speech. Like there's a meaning behind it. We all wore red because it was meant to be a show of solidarity amongst teachers, that we wanted raises, that we wanted better working conditions, but we didn't want to strike because we didn't want to leave our kids. We didn't want the kids to fall behind, right? Some more sort of prominent examples of symbolic speech are Texas versus Johnson in 1989. Kid burnt the American flag on the Capitol up in Austin, the Texas state Capitol, as a means of protest, right? Like, can you burn the American flag in protest? And the answer is yes, you absolutely can. The Supreme Court is clear on that. There are some limitations to symbolic speech, though. So you can't burn draft cards, for instance, because that's destruction of official government property or government documents. So you can burn a flag, but you can't burn your draft card. You don't get draft cards anymore. Now you just sign up for the Selective Service online. But then also symbolic speech, like pointing a gun at somebody would not be permissible. In reality, pointing finger guns in this day and age isn't really permissible either. Free and fair trials, free press and fair trials. So we have free press, but it does conflict with free trials from time to time, because the press is capable, should be capable of covering the news and covering trials and covering issues like that. Trials are public, but then that can lead to instances in which it's hard to get a fair trial. If you're a celebrity, Michael Jackson, for instance, when he was put on trial, I forget the year, but for child molestation, obviously it was all over the news. And so at that point, like, how easy is it to get a fair trial when most of your jurors probably come into it already having heard a lot of the details through the news? Commercial speech. So advertising is actually regulated by the Federal Trade Commission. You can't have false claims. There are actually like specific requirements, right? Like you take take Oreos, right? Like take a cookie. I don't know how many calories are in Oreos, but let's just say for the sake of argument that there's 100 calories in a single Oreo, right? The Federal Trade Commission in advertising ensures that Oreo can't like slap a label on the front of it. It's like reduced calorie Oreos, and then it's like this one's only 99 calories. Like it's still a lot of calories for a single cookie. I don't know if it's a lot of calories. That's kind of a lot, because then like 20 Oreos would be everything that you should eat in a day, and I feel like that's not very much. But anyway, so there's limitations on how you advertise. There's actually like standards that you have to meet. If you want to say like, oh, this is reduced fat, you have to actually reduce the fat by, I think it's 33%. I looked it up at one point in time. I don't care about the number. The number's irrelevant. But there are standards written into law that you have to meet. The FCC is the Federal Communications Commission, and they oversee public airwaves. But I think we talked about Howard Stern a little bit, right? But this is the idea that like obscenity is not necessarily protected. Howard Stern was actually routinely fined when he was on public radio, late 80s, predominantly in the 90s. Predominantly, he was huge in the 90s, right? Huge in the 90s. He was routinely fined by the FCC for saying things that violated obscenity standards. And yes, he intentionally tried to push limitations and try to claim free speech, but ultimately that doesn't really hold weight for him. Campaign spending, we've already talked about. We talked about this in detail with campaigning and Citizens United, so I'm going to just skip over it. If you don't remember, you're welcome to go back and watch the campaigning video. Freedom of assembly is actually a little twofold as well. So you can assemble, but you can also associate. Assembly means that you're allowed to gather together in large groups, but the government can put restrictions on it, and it's important for you to understand. They can dictate time and place. So, for instance, you can't, like, you're never going to get a permit to hold a rally on I-59. Like, it's not going to happen. I don't care what time of day you want to do it. It's not safe. You're not going to get the permit for it. You can also have some issues, and you'll see. We'll do an exercise about all of this, but whether or not protesting becomes harassment and what is or is not permissible in that regard. So the KKK is probably a fairly good example in terms of the right to assemble. Obviously, because they're terrible people. Right? They're white supremacist bigots. Yet they have the right to assemble peaceably, provided that it's on public property. Right? Like the KKK can't hold a rally in your front yard. Like, that's not okay. But if they want to hold a rally in a public park, that is permissible, even if we vehemently disagree with the message. Right to associate simply means that membership lists are protected. So government can't force the ACLU or the NAACP or any organization to give up its memberships. Right to associate also extends to the government, right? So like military recruiters, for instance, get access to public schools. Some people would like to see that stop, but that's something that has been deemed permissible. Right to associate also allows for some limitations, and I think the case was Dale versus the Boy Scouts of America as to whether or not associations could limit membership based upon certain things. Second Amendment's right to bear arms. We talked about this a little bit in the Thursday lecture, but obviously we know that you have a right to bear arms, you have a right to guns. There is a provision in the Second Amendment that says being necessary for a well-regulated militia. Do you have to be in a militia to own a gun? And the predominant answer has been no. D.C. v. Heller basically said that the District of Columbia couldn't deny somebody the opportunity to purchase a firearm, a handgun. Heller, I forget exactly how the case went down, but basically Heller ended up in a situation where D.C. would have made it impossible for him to legally own a gun without actually outlawing guns. Like they made it to where you couldn't get any new permits or something like that. McDonald versus Chicago, however, because D.C. is federal land, it's federal, it's not a state, and so it's always had to abide by the Bill of Rights. McDonald v. Chicago, on the other hand, is that's the amendment that actually incorporates. It's the case that actually incorporates the Second Amendment to the states. There are some limitations, though. Again, this is not an absolute right either. Obviously, we limit firearm purchases by age. You can't be 10 and walk in and buy a gun. Probably not a good idea. Also, we talked about or I don't know if we did it in a video or if it was one of my classes who talked about it. But the idea of arms, right? You have a right to bear arms. Obviously you learned in the U.S. history class about the nuclear arms race. So arms is simply another word for weapon, right? So do you have the right to own a nuclear weapon? Do you have the right to own a nuclear arms, right? Bear arms, nukes. No, you don't. You certainly do not have the right to own a nuclear weapon. You don't have the right to own a tank. You don't have the right to own uranium-depleted shells. You don't have the right to own, you probably don't even have the right to own an AT-4, which is an anti-tank weapon. There's certainly limitations on it. Right now, basically the limitation is sort of machine guns, right? So you can own a semi-automatic rifle. Fully automatic rifles, however, are not permissible. Defendants' rights, these are multiple amendments, right? So the Fourth Amendment, search and seizure, Fifth Amendment, crimination, Sixth Amendment, right to counsel and trial, and then Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment. I'll let you look over this on your own, but basically the judicial system, like most of our government, is not efficient. And interestingly enough, part of the Sixth Amendment is you have a right to a speedy trial, but for the most part, you don't want that right to a speedy trial. The Fourth Amendment protects you against unlawful or unreasonable searches and seizures. So the government can't just come into your house. They can't just decide to stop you. They can't just decide to search your car. I do need you to understand there's some limitations to that. You come on campus, they absolutely can search your car. They can search your locker. Your person becomes slightly different, but even then, the threshold is not necessarily the same, right? You don't always have the same rights on campus as what you do elsewhere, right? But the idea of search and seizures is like the New York City stop and frisk program, right? Like, can cops just stop people randomly on the sidewalk and like pat them down? which is probably not true. There is the exclusionary rule, so there's some limitations on what can and can't be used in a court based upon how that information was discovered. If there's inevitable discovery, then it's not excluded. But if it's not in a warrant or it wasn't part of the purpose, then it can actually be excluded, and the prosecution can't use it. Ultimately, most of the Fourth Amendment, sadly, is going to go out the window, however, with the Patriot Act, because, hey, government's spying on you now. Self-incrimination, you just don't have to testify against yourself, right? Like if you're, no, understand though, it's only against yourself. You cannot plead the Fifth for somebody else, okay? A lot of this comes out of Miranda. You probably know Miranda versus Arizona because you've probably watched a procedural law show on TV like Law and Order, where they go over the Miranda rights weekly. Right to a trial and right to counsel. So right to counsel is Gideon versus Wainwright. That's one of your required cases. So Gideon basically was prosecuted in Florida and not given an attorney. And so he was locked up and put in jail and ultimately petitioned all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so now states have to provide an attorney as well. Excuse me. And plea bargaining is the most common outcome of criminal cases. However, it is not. It's not a right you have, right? The prosecution does not have to reach a plea agreement with you. You have a right to a trial by jury. 12 is generally the standard, although not all states use 12. I think Florida uses 6. And then there's some limitations on these trials as well. So a fair trial is basically the idea that that theoretically the 12 people who are judging you are representative of you, meaning they're members of your community, and then theoretically they also know nothing about the case prior to the case beginning, nor do they learn anything about the case other than what is presented in the courtroom. There are some limitations to this, though, and Guantanamo Bay is a fairly good example. If you don't know Gitmo, it's a Navy base in Cuba. It's actually U.S. soil, and that's where we hold, we can't even call them prisoners. We call them detainees. Like, that's the official name. They're just detained. They're just detained indefinitely because these are people that have been picked up in the war on terror, and they're not given a trial. They're not brought before a judge. And there are some people that actually argue that this is completely permissible because they're not U.S. citizens and therefore they're not subject to the Constitution. Some people say, regardless of whether or not the Constitution applies to non-citizens, these are military combatants and therefore they're war criminals, war prisoners, and that is not relatable to the Constitution. It's a habeas corpus. There are other people that would actually think that what we're doing here is utterly atrocious, that we just leave these people locked up for years and years. Cruel and unusual to punishment. This is actually not a concept that's ever been defined, although it has been incorporated. So there are instances in which cruel and unusual punishment has been incorporated. We have the Supreme Court on record as saying that the death penalty is not cruel and unusual. However, you cannot execute minors. The court has made a stipulation on that. So if a 14-year-old is to commit murder, they cannot be executed for that. And 2, you cannot execute the mentally handicapped. Therefore, if they commit a crime, usually it's deemed to be a want of understanding. They don't really understand what they did. You can't execute them for it. That being said, there's fewer executions in the United States today than what there were, although that's due in part to the fact that some states have limited their executions drastically. And obviously, you see, based on that graphic, Texas is not one of them. Right to privacy. Do we have a right to privacy? Theoretically, this is the Ninth Amendment. The Ninth Amendment is basically a catch-all. It says that we have more rights than what are listed. Griswold versus Connecticut is a really significant Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court basically admitted that a right to privacy is implied between the Fourth and Ninth Amendments. So you have a right to privacy according to the court. And this ultimately is sort of where abortion comes in, because ultimately there is some privacy issues at hand pertaining to a woman's health care and her own decision about what to do with her body. Although obviously there's a significant balancing act from allowing for privacy and autonomy of a female body, and then the state's interest or the government's interest in protecting prenatal life or fetal life or whatever term you want to use, depending on which side of the sort of abortion debate you fall on. And so basically Roe versus Wade says, yeah, you can't outlaw abortions, but it does not say in any way that you can't put limitations on them. And so then ultimately we go from sort of what Roe versus Wade said to a case, Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992, that instead of it being a strict scrutiny, meaning strict scrutiny again here is the idea that the government has to prove that it's absolutely necessary for them to have this life, or excuse this law, in this case, banning abortion or outlawing abortion or making abortion more difficult, to the undue burden sort of test. And so basically, can the state make it difficult for you or more difficult for you to obtain abortion? Yes. But if the burden is not insurmountable, then that law would generally be deemed permissible by the courts. So again, these are protests over undue burden and over the new, at the time, new standard that the Supreme Court applied. But basically the idea is that undue burden essentially means that again, the law is permissible provided that it's not overly burdensome for the individual or overly restrictive. And so it's essentially a step toward, I don't want to say it's a step toward overturning Roe versus Wade, but it's certainly a step toward ensuring that there are limitations on Roe versus Wade and that states can set some of those standards themselves. That's probably the best way of explaining it. So understanding civil rights and civil liberties in terms of democracy and the scope of government. So civil liberties and democracy actually exist or work because the liberties of the minority are generally what need to be protected by government. And so civil liberties are actually sort of anti-democratic. Again, think about it with like the protections to the KKK and their right to assemble and their right to espouse their hate speech, right? Most of us, all of us, I hope all of us, think that that's abhorrent, right? That it's terrible. That anybody who thinks or feels that way is, naive at best, or just downright terrible. Yet we allow fringe groups to have their civil liberties, and so the very expression of those civil liberties is undemocratic. As far as it pertains to the scope of government, civil liberties exist in order to limit governmental behavior that is burdensome upon our lives, that becomes restrictive toward us. Okay. So democracy is sort of essential for freedom of speech. But again, like I just said, the majority rule versus minority rights there, the middle point, is ultimately what is to me most important as it pertains to how democracy and liberty um, play out, right? So obviously, in order for democracy to work, we need to be smart. Again, I've told you I need you to be a well-educated voter. I need you to be understanding of what the issues are. But the idea of majority rule versus minority rights is really where liberty and civil liberty and the need for government, the actual need for government exists. Um, and then scope, and this is the last slide. We believe in individual liberty in this country. It's an essential aspect of our sort of guiding founding principles. Um, and so we want liberty and individualism to prevail, and our civil liberties are meant to ensure that. Um, However, over the course of time, that has gotten increasingly more difficult. Technology allows for more intrusion. I mean, literally, you can search anybody on the internet these days, um, and government has taken more liberty. I mean, they've taken more authority to sort of trample upon our liberties in in the name of protection, right? I mean, the Patriot Act exists solely so that we can be safe and secure from terrorism. That's the justification that the government gives for denying you your privacy, which is a slippery slope. Again, um, I don't know that the Patriot Act. I mean, I don't know. Obviously I'm not high up in intelligence. I don't work in the Pentagon. I don't work for the CIA or the FBI. I don't know that the Patriot Act hasn't saved us or hasn't kept us safe from terrorism over the last nearly 2 decades. But I do know that it's cost me my liberty. It's cost me my privacy. It's cost me some of my freedoms. Um, and and for me, that's a heavy price to pay. Um, and for me, it's probably too heavy a price to pay. But ultimately, that's a concern that exists as a result of how government interacts with civil liberties. So that's it for the lecture for all of this. So I know it's a little long, but again, I really do believe that this is sort of essential. And so the next few days we'll sort of practice with some of these ideas.